So I'm going to do a quick introduction for my mom, and then I'll show a clip from her film, and I'm going to let her talk. But my father's family was, my father's born in Canada. His family immigrated to Canada in the early 1920s, and my mom's an immigrant. And she's been a textile artist most of her life, so she's been telling stories through art. And filmmaking is also an art, so she's taken her medium. So she's still a weaver and still a textile artist, but she's decided in her 60s, a couple of years ago, that she also wanted to tell motion picture stories. And a lot of her stories relate to her being an artist, so she's told some stories about artists, but her stories also tie back into her cultural connection and her history to other Finns and other immigrant, particularly from the Finnish community in Canada. So let me show a clip from her film.
Her legacy has gone far and wide. G and push it back up, sit up straight. She came up with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. She was a lead violinist, and she realized there was no kids playing fiddles in the Delta, and she thought that was quite sinful.
It's really important the work she's doing in the Aboriginal community to keep fiddling alive.
Certainly one of a kind, if anybody knows who's met her. She has an energy that is totally captivating.
You feel anything moving? Yeah.
Amazing person and a lot to teach us.
I just realized that I'm standing on a rug that is full of ladybugs. My name, Pirkko, means ladybug in the Finnish language in poetic form. When it's used in poetic form, it's called Pirkko. Anyway, I never had any idea that I was going to be making any films. We started our company, Karvonen Films, some 40 years ago, and I was always the so-called go-awaster. In wildlife, one walks the other person to the blind, and then I go away. So the birds think that you're gone. So when I was over 60, I wanted Albert to make a film on Sointula. I had always read about the stories and history about Sointula. And somewhere along the line, I was at a Finnish conference in Sudbury, and I met a woman who was going to be going to Sointula. She had a doctorate and she was working at a university in the States. So she asked me to go to Sointula with her. So both Albert and I did go to Sointula with her, and that's where my idea of my first film came, was from that trip.
So, can you say what Sointula is?
Sointula is a Finnish utopian colony on Malcolm Island. It was started 1900s, and it was started by Matti Kurikka, who was a utopian socialist. Finland was not independent at the time, and he wanted to have a Finland somewhere. So that's how it got started. And he did get, the first people came from United States, and then later people from Finland, because he was advertising it in all kinds of writing and so on. So anyway, when I was showing this film in Minneapolis, I came upon my friend here, Meredith Fuller, whose book we also have here. She's going to be doing a spiel on her book, which deals partly with the Finnish immigration.
How did you tell, why did you want us to tell Andrea's story?
Okay, so anyway, I was making a film, another film on Finnish immigration in Toronto. And we were at the Finnish seniors' home. So I was told that there's a lady here who's a violinist, that you should meet her. She's visiting her mother. So that's how I met Andrea. And we did actually some footage on her, which I used on the Andrea film called Strings Across the Sky. And her name is Hanson, but that's not what her father's name was, and it was not her married name. I think somewhere along the line, when her father went to look for a job, he had to change his name, because they would say, oh, we're not hiring any Finlanders, but if you come back tomorrow, your name is Johnson or Hansen or whatever in this case was given the name to him. So he was born in a place called Newfoundland in Saskatchewan. And you don't find Newfoundland on the map, but there are history books written that are called Newfoundland. And Nancy Matson, who was an editor at the University of Alberta, wrote a book on Newfoundland. And that is where Andrea's roots are. So she met a person in Yellowknife when she was with the Toronto Symphony. She later became a violinist in Montreal Symphony and later Toronto Symphony. So this native person was lamenting that the fiddling was dying in the Canadian North, that something had to be done about it. So that together they both worked together and started Strings Across the Sky. So that's what this film is about.
Perfect timing, because we're almost out of time here. So I was just going to say, to add to, Mom was talking about the immigrants changing their names. Finns were known for being agitators and being involved with the labor movement. So they knew if they had these Finlanders working with them that there might be trouble, they might try to unionize. So that's quite often what had happened, is they asked people change their names so they could get a job. And that's why a lot of immigrants ended up with different names, not to mention the fact that the immigration people couldn't spell their names. And I'll add just a point about Mom. So when she came to Canada, she was a teenager, and her name's Pirkko, and my auntie's name is Maya. But when they went to school, they were asked to choose another name that would be easier for the teachers to say. And my mom's line to me always was, I had to learn a whole new language. The teacher only had to learn one word, my name. And it reminds me now as a teacher, because I teach part-time, that I have students there from different parts of the world, how important it is that I learn their name, because quite often, like my students, they'll take on a Canadian or an English name just to make it easier or to fit in. But I think we should be proud of who we are and keep our names, because our names are part of our story of who we are.
Yeah, I have one more thing. I was given two names, Pat or Pearl, and I couldn't pronounce Pearl, so I chose Pat. Now, my first child was in grade 1, and he said, Mom, you should not go by a nickname. So I started changing my name, and all my papers, even my bank account was in this name, Pat. So it took some courage to go back to my name. There was a law in Finland, 1600s, that you had to read and write, or otherwise you couldn't get married. So in the archives in Ottawa, National Archives, all the records are kept because every time Finns had a meeting, it was recorded. For example, the first meeting of the British Columbia Fishermen's Association, the records are in the Finnish language because it's the Finns that started the Fishermen's Association.
So if you want to know about Finns in Canada, she's one of your go-to people. So a lot of times I'll be at a conference and somebody, for example, my friend Andrew Best was working for this Finnish games company in Canada, this Habbo Hotel over at City TV many years ago. And he was talking on a panel, and he was talking about how he got this job because he had his Finnish passport as well, which I have. And I said, well, what's your Finnish side? And he goes, well, my mom's name is Varpu. And I said, Lindstrom Best? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, how do you know my mom? I said, my mom knows every Finn in Canada she's connected to. So I always think it's a great connection I have to my heritage. And as I age, my heritage becomes more important too. And now I'm kind of saying, I got to hurry and get all these stories from Mom. Because she knows so much about this history of this Finnish migration in Canada because she did migrate to Canada, and that's important to her. And I would say, a lot of us, we should make sure we are collecting stories from our family because they'll take those stories with them. And there's different waves of migration to different parts of the world, and we know that that lingering bit of racism, I guess it's not lingering, it's still there, because when we think about the internment of Japanese, Chinese, Indigenous people with the residential schools and that racism, there's still a residual there. It didn't just go away, and we're seeing that resurface now in our world politics. And we had migrants then coming to Edmonton, where we live, that were from kind of Southeast Asia, and then there was waves of migration with people from Chile that might have been. Now we have people from the Middle East. And I think we need to remember about our collective history and make sure that we are kind to those people who are coming, just like our families came, for new opportunities and to escape war and be understanding as much as we can and realize that, people have been through a lot before they came to Canada. Let's, should we open it up to questions? I think we've got just time for one or two, and then I don't want to take away from Meredith's presentation, but do you guys have a few questions? And then I'll also be later during our screening.
I just want to say something too, because I have a Finnish name, Ilona, but I go by Pat. So there you go. And my husband's family, his grandfather came from Finland, and his name was Finland, and he moved to Finland and changed it to Kenora to fit it. He was a businessman, and he wanted to get his business to flourish, so he changed his name as well. So happened here too.
My Polish neighbor changed his name to a very English name as well. It's like Massajuski, and he changed it to Gill. I don't know, I guess he wanted a short name that would fit in and not show his heritage too.
I'd like to bring attention to Varpu Lindström because she directed each one of my ethnic films about Finns. She would tell me what archives to go to. I couldn't get some information. It was closed at the National Archives of Canada. I was told it's closed for 100 years. So she said, go to Minneapolis. So I went to Minneapolis. I stayed in a bed and breakfast place for a whole week. And that's where I got a lot of the information. And workers' archives in Finland. So everything that I presented in the films, I could document them from information that was achieved going to the archives.
And the Finnish connection.
Yeah, that Finnish connection. So any other questions? Okay, let's take the mic off Mum, and we're going to move it over.